Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for the next webinar in the Kinship Conservation Fellows Cases in Conservation Finance series. We're just going to do a quick intro while people are still joining, and then we'll get started with our discussion today. Really excited to have JP Gibbons here with us for this third webinar. My name is Shelby Riggle. I'm the Senior Program Associate at the Kinship Foundation. Kinship Conservation Fellows is an environmental leadership program of the Kinship Foundation. The program develops communities of leaders dedicated to collaborative approaches to environmental issues with a focus on market-based principles. The program aims to make the conservation sector more efficient, effective, and collaborative by building the capacity of practitioners through training programs, including our flagship fellowship and regional workshops. And I should mention that JP Gibbons is a 2015 Kinship Fellow. We are super excited to have him in our network. So the program also supports a global community of fellows like JP, and we disseminate knowledge on a range of conservation topics. So in this webinar series, which is new for us this year, each month we're hearing from guest speakers and learning about what's new in conservation finance, learning about the innovative work that's happening in the field, how the tools are being used to address finance of conservation outcomes, and what we can all learn from the practical experiences on the ground. So I want to give a special thank you to Ceci Simone, a 2014 Kinship Fellow, for helping to organize this series. So before we get started, just a few logistics of how today's session will work. It's a moderated discussion between Ricardo and JP. They'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes and all attendees will be muted. During that time, please type your questions into the questions pane whenever they come up. And then we'll do a Q&A section after the discussion. And during that time, Ricardo will help to facilitate questions and we'll unmute all attendees who have questions, and you can go ahead and ask your question directly to JP or Ricardo. So just lastly, before I pass it to Ricardo, just want to introduce our moderator. Ricardo is a partner at Encourage Capital, where he leads the water team. He also helped found Ecosystem Marketplace and has 2 decades of experience in finance, banking, and the environment. Ricardo currently serves on our Kinship Conservation Fellows Advisory Council and is faculty at our fellowship program. So again, JP, thanks for being here, and Ricardo, I'll pass it over to you to get started.
Thanks so much, Shelby. So yes, welcome to this next in our series of conservation innovations. We're really pleased to have JP with us. As Shelby said, he was not only a fellow, but he went on to do some really interesting work, both on the governmental side at USAID and currently at Cambridge. I'd like to ask JP to basically give a little bit more background on where he comes from and how he got into what he's doing. Tell us a little bit about the work he's currently doing at Cambridge, and then I'd like us to sort of go back to the sort of work he did at USAID, because I think there's some really interesting innovations there around the role of government and how government can work with the private sector. And you know, he can reflect on what he learned there and also bring it together with what he's doing now and what some of the lessons have been since he's moved over to the private sector. So hopefully we will have a good discussion about the role of government, private sector, how government interrelates. And I want to thank all of you for your feedback. I've been getting feedback on what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong. We're trying to fix what we're doing wrong. So apologies if there's movement in my video or whatever. We'll try to fix it next time around. And I've heard also that we would like to hear more cases from developing countries, and we're working on that. You know, JP will actually talk about work with developing countries through USAID. And next, the next one of our case studies will be about water funds in Latin America. So we're going to start to really diversify outside, not just US cases, but cases from around the world. And so I'd also like to ask you guys, if you have cases that you would like us to focus on, or if you find, you know, really interesting things that are going on that we should know about, please do email me or send a note to Shelby or provide feedback to this webinar. But without further ado, JP, maybe we can get into it. Tell us a little bit about how you got into this space and what you've done and your work at Cambridge.
Sure. Thanks for the intro, Ricardo, and thanks for having me on today. So in terms of how I really got into development and conservation finance, it came from a college degree in finance. And I did 2 years of rather traditional financial consulting for a valuation firm where I crunched numbers and worked with Microsoft Excel a lot, and to the point where I just said, I don't know if this is the long-term career for me, at least not at this moment. So I stared at enough Microsoft Excel sheets that I decided that it was time to do something completely different, and I joined the Peace Corps. And I went to Guatemala, which was far away. I didn't see Microsoft Excel for 2 years, so I accomplished that part of my
numbers.
objective.
I just want to deal with people on the ground. And
yeah, I needed that real world experience and not just in front of a computer screen. So I worked in Guatemala for 2 years helping, and this was at 25, 26 years old. So it's not like I had a wealth of experience, but was able to help some environmental nonprofits on better business activities and better operations, just from a general business, more sustainable perspective. And I came back from Guatemala with like 2 years of finance experience and 2 years of development experience. And through some connections, found out that there was this office within USAID, and I'll explain what USAID is, or USAID as you might know it. It is the US government's development agency. It provides grants and other development support throughout the world, active in, I believe it's between 80 and 90 countries. It's technically under the State Department, but does a lot of development work in many countries in which a lot of Kinship Fellows come from. And so I was able to get this opportunity within USAID in this office that kind of merges both development and finance, investment specifically, in that what the Office of Development Credit, or the DCA, Development Credit Authority, does or did was it worked with people looking to invest money in developing countries and made it easier through mitigating that risk. And I can go into a little bit more detail, as you mentioned, in our conversation. But I ended up staying at the DCA office for 10 years because I enjoyed it so much. I got my MBA while I was there in a sustainable MBA. As well, but then also kind of evolved in my role, where at first I worked a lot with local banks, financial institutions in these countries, and that evolved to doing more of what is probably the more innovative and catalytic development finance, and specifically in conservation, with investment funds that were raising capital and trying to put that capital directly towards conservation projects that they found could hit a financial return that was suitable for them and the people that gave them the capital, their investors, and doing so with that holistic ecosystem, environmental, conservation, social, and financial return perspective to it. And so I worked on a number of projects in oceans, whether it be sustainable fisheries or plastic waste. I did a number of sustainable agricultural deals and some around endangered forest and rainforest protection as well. So I was there 10 years, and then just last summer, about a year ago now, I realized that I'd been working with the private sector for a long time, and felt like I should get that perspective. And having been in one office for 10 years, it was a while, and I knew the office really well, and I loved the work, but it was time to see things from the other side of the table. And so I joined a group called Cambridge Associates, and what we specifically within their impact investment team. And what we do is we advise large asset owners. These are colleges and universities and big foundations and high net worth individuals and families, and advise them on how they should be investing their capital for not just financial return, which is necessary for them, because this is the capital that they're paying their bills with. If it's a university, they're paying all their expenses with this capital, so they need to they can't just give it away. They need to make a return off it, but also with the most impact they can. And so I've been there for a year, and I don't know if this is the right time, but can kind of go into a little bit more of what USAID did and explain that to those listening, and then how that's evolved to what I'm doing now. If you think that that would be the next step, or you let me know what you would like to hear.
No, let's talk a little bit about the work at USAID and did there. First, does that office, the DCA, still exist within USAID?
It's a great point, and a good time to bring it up. So the DCA office was an office of about 30 people within USAID, and what we would do is we were basically consultants for the rest of USAID. We would help put deals together for the USAID offices in all the countries. USAID has offices in most countries and operates it. So we would go down to Colombia and do a deal in Colombia for the USAID Colombia mission, or to Ghana, or to Indonesia, or wherever it may be. And we were consultants for them. Now that office, because it was so specific in what it did in putting investment transactions together with financial institutions, that it left USAID this past year to join another development finance organization, which was called the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, to join what is now the US Development Finance Corporation. They're called DFIs, Development Finance Institutions, and there's many of them around the world. The EIB is a big one, European Investment Bank. The IFC, which is a part of the World Bank, is another one. And many European countries, Canada, the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank. These are all, if you hear these terms, what these are development finance institutions. Their capital from the host countries used to try and spur development with their investment dollars. And that can be done in many ways, whether it be through lending, loans, through equity investments, ownership in companies, through risk mitigation tools like the credit guarantee that my office used, or political risk insurance, or first loss protection, many different tools that such organizations can utilize. And it just so happens, since I left, my office went to this new one that was created, the Development Finance Corporation, which is the US DFI.
Let's be honest, it's not entirely philanthropic in a sense, that a lot of that aid money ends up paying for work of US companies or subsidizing US investment firms. So, there are benefits for the US.
Absolutely.
But what was interesting to me about your work at USAID was how you would try to use some of that government money to incentivize private investment in conservation. Maybe you can tell us about a couple of deals, because what I found fascinating was the fact that the way you were using credit guarantees to try to get private capital to invest in conservation. And to me, that really touches on a fundamental point of private finance and conservation finance in general. And that is that I like to say that capitalism and investment runs on two of the most powerful human emotions, greed and fear. And greed is return. And if you want more money, you put more money into invest and you try to get more money out of it. And that greed drives investment. On the other side, you have risk or fear that you will lose that money. And so there's a balance between greed and fear, between risk and return. And if you increase the return, you get more investment. If you decrease the risk, you get more investment. And I think what was interesting is that you guys were using those dials of risk and return, greed and fear, to try to incentivize investment in developing countries and in conservation. And in particular, this credit guarantee structure was trying to play with that risk dial, right? Lowering the risk of investment and providing these guarantees. So maybe you can tell us how that worked. Was it effective? And can you give us an example of where this was used to address a conservation issue?
Absolutely. And you explain it so well. And I think it's something that is important for those that, at least in my class in the kinship program, to understand that risk return balance, because many times fellows from kinship will come with great concepts, great market-based ideas for how they're going to solve a conservation challenge, but might not really understand as well what drives getting investment dollars into their project. And so the greed and fear example is a great one. And to explain a little bit, I think I'm just going to share my screen here. Which one is it? It's this one. So can you see my screen now?
Yeah, it's a little small. You might make it a tiny bit bigger, but
okay, let's see if I can. Where's the plus? So this, there's a lot. I just want to explain this for some people at a high level. There's a lot of graphs like this, or images that show the same thing, but this one's pretty simple, and I thought it was okay. And that you have to think, if you're a person with a conservation project or an environmental project that you're looking to get capital to, you have to really evaluate that risk return, greed and fear weighing of both sides scale, the push and pull, to determine what type of capital you should really be targeting. And on the far left side of this chart, there's grants, and that's if your project is likely not going to be able to return any money to those that provide money to it, then you're probably only looking for a grant. You can't really talk about impact investing when your capital isn't going to provide any returns. On the far other side are those investments where it might have great environmental benefit to it, it might have great conservation benefit, but it also returns a profit just as well as any traditional investment would, whether it be an investment in the public stock market. So on that side, it could be great impact, but you could go for a whole bunch of different investors if you have a return outlook that shows it's very possible or profitable. It's in the middle there that things get really tricky, right? And they have impact investing in the middle there. It might be market rate return, so what you would expect. It might be a little bit below. And when it is a little bit below, that's when products like the one that I worked on with the Development Credit Authority really came into play. Those products that can mitigate some risk to make that balance of greed and fear more equal and palatable for an investor. So this is basically what we did. I just have a quick chart of it. You have in this case, it's a farmer, and he's looking for a loan in a developing country. Now, many banks in developing countries, they're highly conservative, and there's other reasons why it's difficult for many people in developing countries to not unable to get loans. They might not have collateral, they might not own their land, they might not have any credit history or strong proof of the income that they get from the farmers, and so higher levels of risk. And so the bank says, you know what, I'm not sure if this person, this farmer, Abe, in this example, is creditworthy. And if you follow the chain here, that's where my old office and still what they do with the Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, can come in and say to the bank, well, what if there's a whole bunch of Abes out there and they all seem to have decent businesses, but they're just not quite up to your caliber of creditworthiness because they don't have the collateral that you usually expect, or they don't have a credit history with your bank.
For those that are not into finance, collateral is basically what you put down and say, if you don't pay the loan, what does the bank get? Like, is it your land? Is it the house? Is it the farm? You know, what are you putting against your loan in case you don't pay it back? So
that's a great point. Thank you. And so we would work with any kind of financial institution. In this case, a bank. I worked, as I mentioned before, with a lot of investment funds later at my time at DCA. And what we would do is say, okay, if you make loans to Abe and farmers like Abe, or conservation projects like X, Y, and Z, and that loan goes bad, Abe's business goes bankrupt because either he's a poor farmer, or because there was a drought that year, or because of some other situation, whatever that may be. For the most part, many situations are covered, almost most, if not all, under this type of guarantee. If that's the case, we'll pay you back half the money that you lent him. We're protecting 50% of the money that if it was a $100 loan, $50 of it you're guaranteed to get back from us. Now, why that's helpful in a loan situation is because banks and others that make loans, they have a capped upside. It's not like equity, right? Like, it's not like you're buying Tesla when it was, really cheap, and then it shoots through the roof because everyone wants to own a Tesla now. You're not going to make 100% or 1,000% return with this. You're going to make maybe 10, 15% return on any loan. And therefore, it's great to protect your downside with lending. And so we would do that with financial institutions, first with local banks. And then, as I mentioned, my work evolved to work with a lot of conservation-oriented investment funds. The first really conservation-oriented one that I worked with was Althelia, which is now Morova Althelia, their global climate fund, which invested in endangered rainforests throughout the global south. Really, there's a project in Indonesia that a fellow Kinship volunteer actually, or Kinship Fellow worked on. He pretty much got that one off the ground. There's some in sub-Saharan Africa. There's many in Latin America. And basically what they did was provided loans to communities to encourage them not to clear cut the forest, and rather to protect the forest and have other sustainable livelihood activities around the forest for them to make an income, while also making income from the generation of carbon credits, REDD+ credits specifically, for a lot of the loans that they made. So that's just one example. But to finish the, go ahead.
Let's unpick this a little bit, JP.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that there was this investment firm, Morova Althelia,
Yes.
at the time, that basically had private capital. They wanted to invest in projects that would be carbon projects that would generate REDD credits, carbon credits around the world, Indonesia, Latin America, Africa, all over the world. They were saying, investment in this project in Indonesia, that's a highly risky investment. It could go under. We may not see our money back. The carbon may not be able to be sold, what have you. So in steps USAID and says, look, we're going to lower the risk for you. We're not going to take the risk away, but we'll lower it so that there's less risk than if you didn't have this kind of guarantee. So how did the guarantee work? You said, if you invest $100, 50 of it will be protected and you will get it back no matter what? Or how was it structured?
That is traditionally how it is structured. And there's some complexities with an investment fund versus a bank, in that an investment fund they don't have in this case, it was like $120 million fund. And Althelia did not have that money at the start. They needed to go convince asset owners to put their money with them based on their strategy. So they had this idea, this strategy, as you described it, in investing in endangered forests, endangered rainforests, with the idea that they would be able to generate income from the carbon credits and other sources of income. But they had to convince others, and that's where our guarantee was most helpful for them. They were able to go to people with the capital, high net worth individuals and foundations and some of the development banks, and say, we believe in this strategy. We believe it's going to have a return of X. I think it was in the mid-teens, but it's risky. It was without a doubt very risky. So they also said, USAID is willing to work with us, and they're willing to pay back some of the losses on projects if they don't materialize as we expected. So we're going to go out and find what we think are the best projects and hope that they're successful. But if they don't, your $5 million investor A that you give us, you can be assured that you're not going to lose all of that, because USAID is going to come and pay back a lot of it, or a good portion of it, usually 50%, as I mentioned. And that gave the investors sufficient resolve that this was a good investment concept. And to show you the bump, that this is where my job was really the last 5 years. Before our deal was finalized, Althelia had about, I believe it was about $25 to $35 million worth of capital that they had raised from investors. When they finished, they were at 120 to 125 million. And so being able to go out and make your sales pitch with a risk mitigating tool behind it was very helpful to them.
Yeah, I think,
And
it's interesting. It's like akin to, if you're going to lend money to somebody you don't know if they'll pay it back. You don't have that trust. And in fact, the word credit in Latin comes from credere, to believe. You don't believe that you will get your money back, right? But if somebody that you do know, somebody who pays back, like the US government or USAID says, you know what, lend him the $100. The worst that'll happen is they won't pay you back, in which case we'll step in and pay you back 50. That's kind of how credit guarantee works. And what's interesting in your case is that you're lowering that risk for the investor so that, the return stays where it was, mid-teens, you said, 15% IRR, whatever it was. But the risk just went down by half. All of a sudden, that risk return calculation that the investor makes is more heavily weighted to the return than the risk than it was before. So greed overtakes fear and you invest. And you were doing that for conservation projects, which is interesting.
yeah,
You want to talk about the standard product? Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to
yeah, no, that you mentioned we brought up how Althelia did it with carbon credits for the rainforest and protection of the carbon sinks through REDD+ credits. But there were a lot of sustainable agricultural deals that I did too. One in Indonesia stands out because it was really targeted at this one sustainable rubber plantation that we worked on at DCA, and focusing on raising capital specifically for the Indonesian farmers to grow sustainable rubber that even had a buyer in one of the big tire companies. And the conservation angle of that one and a lot of the sustainable agricultural pieces was, well, if they don't trying to find that sustainable rubber income for farmers, because otherwise they typically resort to more slash and burn type agricultural activities, because that's the best option for them. So these projects, they're sometimes new and greenfield, and many greenfield projects have a lot of risk tied to them. And that's where that fear, people are saying, do I really want to invest in a sustainable rubber project in the middle of Indonesia that hasn't been done before except on a little pilot basis? And USAID can come in and say, well, what if half of that money is going to be repaid for certain, based on our US Treasury AAA credit rating? And so that's what makes the investors feel a little bit more secure. And I have examples like that in, as I mentioned, ocean plastics and sustainable fisheries, and not just rubber, but many crops, coffee and avocados and what have you throughout the global South. And this last slide I'm showing here is just at the basic level what we did. My job was to find the L, the lender, someone that was motivated to invest in a development activity, largely for me, because I focused on it, in environmental or conservation development activity. Their job was to find the borrowers that they thought best fit their profile of the scope we agreed in. Many of those borrowers would then receive loans from the lender, and certain borrowers might not be able to repay the loan all the way. In those cases, that's where USAID stepped in and paid back that gap, or at least 50% of that gap. And we had a great the program at USAID ran for 20 years and a great track record. We worked in 80 countries, $6 billion got out the door, and the default rate was hovering between 2% and 3%. So very low default rate for what would be perceived as riskier borrowers, because of the lack of some of those typical creditworthy aspects that we mentioned before, whether it be track record or credit history or collateral. And so what it did largely, this program, I think, has proved to a lot of investors that these are investment opportunities that they should be doing with risk mitigating tools, but also after the risk mitigating tools are gone, because they're largely just profitable opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we have a question about talking a little bit about how this applied to sustainable fisheries and ocean projects, and maybe you can go into that a little bit, what those looked like. But also, if you could sort of say, right, this is something that was happening at USAID. I don't know if there's a similar product still in existence at the new entity through OPIC and what OPIC became, but if you're somebody with a conservation project in Africa or Latin America or Asia or the US, how do I use this tool? How do I think about using a tool like this to achieve what I want to achieve?
Yeah, I would say that most people with projects, the best place to go is probably not direct to the DFC or other development bank, but people in the position I was in, and the product still does exist, we would be looking for projects, you know, at the 25 million plus to aggregate many projects through one financial investor. And many of the projects that a lot of fellows are working at are probably not at that size. And so if you have a project that you believe is not at the grant making stage, but is more at that impact investing stage, where I think I could get some investors if there's a risk mitigating tool. And there's a number of tools out there, and different development finance institutions utilize different ones. At the DFC, I know they have the credit guarantees, they have political risk insurance, and I think they have one or two others that are quasi mitigating tools. But there's also a lot of foundations that provide first loss coverage for things that they truly believe in. There's concessional capital, whether it be a family or a foundation or what have you, that says, I'm willing to take less of a return or be at the riskier end of an investment, so that some bigger asset owner with more capital can come in ahead of me. My $5 million or my $500,000 can be at more risk, so that the $25 million investor will come in with less risk. So where I would go if I'm in a country, I would try and reach out to the USAID or other development agency office in that country. It might not be the US government. It might be or who may be. But if you, the best place to
breaking up a tiny bit.
Go ahead.
You were breaking up a tiny bit there. I think you were saying that the first place to go may not be USAID, but maybe the development aid agency of any other country, right? JP, did we lose you?
I'm just gonna turn my video off for a minute and hope that it straightens itself out, and then I'll turn it back on.
All right.
So yes, the first place I would go would be to the local USAID office and talk to them about your project, because that is where they'll let you know whether that is a strategic goal for their mission. If sustainable fisheries is not really a strategic goal of a country mission, it's going to be hard to get a lot of support for doing a deal there. So really going to that local office would be my first step. After that, I would look at seeing what financial institutions are investing in that type of project. You could go into impact investing right now and see that certain investment funds are very much focused on certain areas, such as, well, there's in sustainable fisheries, there's the Sustainable Ocean Fund. In ocean plastics, there's Circulate Capital. So if you do things like that, if you search for certain investment strategies that are out there that fit your sector, reaching out to them, letting them know about your project is not a bad path to getting on their radar, because our goal at USAID and the goal of many of these risk mitigating tools is not to pick the projects, allow the financial institution to pick the project. It's more to incentivize or catalyze the financial institution to go out and do more of what they're best at doing.
And the criteria you use is, does it achieve some sort of conservation, or does it achieve development, because you're not providing these guarantees to just anybody. There has to be some sort of, the criteria that you use to decide, right?
Yes, so that happens when we create the scope of a guarantee, not at the individual borrower level, but when we work with Althelia, or when we work with a local bank, or any of those things. We will tell them what we think defines conservation and what we're trying to achieve and what would be out of that scope, and really want to focus in on those projects that stay within our conservation scope. We had this issue with the sustainable fisheries deal we did, actually. Can you hear me okay, Ricardo? Am I coming through? Okay, good. The sustainable fisheries fund that we worked with wanted to do I believe it was up to like 60 or 75% aquaculture. And USAID, maybe this was not my decision, but we have technical fisheries experts, maybe that are a bit more idealist, said, well, we understand the need for aquaculture. We are really more about growing natural sustainable fisheries. And so we want to limit the amount that we'll allow under the guarantee. So negotiations like that, so that we wanted to ensure our guarantee was not being used for primarily aquaculture, but growing sustainable fisheries in localized communities where overfishing has affected the fishing community and the fish population, and figuring out ways to regrow them naturally was more important to USAID in that situation.
Just to answer the question, can you give like an example or two on fisheries and oceans that you guys did?
Yeah, so there are two sustainable fisheries type deals that we closed during my time there. One was with a group also under the Althelia umbrella called the Sustainable Ocean Fund. They actually just closed their fundraise at, I believe, $130 million that they're looking to of capital that they're looking to put out in the best projects possible. And they have a rather wide scope at what they look at. They're looking at sustainable fisheries projects. There was one that I visited down in La Paz, Mexico, with pen shells that had been totally depleted in a bay there because of overfishing populations, and the fisherman community created a strategic plan of how to repopulate and regrow the amount of pen shells in the bay, and then sustainable harvesting of those pen shells after the regrowth over a 5-year period. So one example that I saw firsthand of how they're going to naturally regrow such fish population. But they're also looking at sustainable landscapes of ocean, such as sustainable reefs in some of the Caribbeans to deal with beach erosion. They're looking at some tourist ideas of sustainable tourist opportunities, both in Southeast Asia and the Caribbean, for bringing in, from what I recall, sort of the high-end luxury tourist opportunities for exclusive tours that will then pay for the fishing community within the area, and working with the fishermen while they're not able to catch as many fish as they used to. So alternative livelihoods in that way. And the other fund that I would mention is
all of these were structured in that similar way as the other Althelia projects, right? They were a credit guarantee from USAID to Althelia Mirova saying, if you invest in this sustainable fisheries oceans deals, we will guarantee a portion of the investment or to your investors, right?
That's correct. Well, there are intricacies about each one because they were unique, and some of the, I don't want to go into too much detail, but some of the funds were investing debt and equity, so we had to account for some of the equity, things of that nature. But all of them said, we're going to provide the guarantee on the chance that some of your investments will not be returned in full, and therefore give your investors, the asset owners, the limited partners, for those that are familiar with funds, some more, reduce their fear, give them some more confidence that some of their capital will ultimately come back, even if not all of it will.
Right. So I guess what you're saying to people out in the field with conservation projects is step one, is there a potential return on investment in your deal? Because that is the sort of sine qua non for this kind of structure, right? Saying, can you return capital? Can you return investment dollars with some sort of return on investment? If you can't, then probably a grant is more what you're looking for. But if you can, there's different ways that you can attract investors. And one of the ways to attract investors is using that risk guarantee mechanism. So playing with that risk dial. You could also potentially play with a return dial, but that's harder because you could be seen as subsidizing private investors. I mean, in a way you are even with this structure, but it is a way of limiting risk. And the nice thing from USAID's perspective is that that money may not ever be used, because if the investment gets paid back with the right return, your money is never touched, right? So it's essentially a guarantee that if all works well, you never ever use any money. You don't deploy any money. Obviously, that rarely happens. There's always defaults. There's always problems. So you probably have to pay out some of the money in all of them. But it's an interesting tool to think about how you channel investment, how you attract investment. I wonder if we could, in the time we have available before questions from everybody out there, and don't forget to type your questions into the chat box, I wonder if we could reflect on what you're seeing now. Now you've gone, as you see, the other side of the table to working with private investors and advising private investors. What have you learned in terms of how you incentivize private capital, the role that governments play, the role that NGOs play, any sort of new learnings that you were like, God, I wish I had known that when I was at USAID, now that you're on the other side?
Sure. Now that I've left and joined Cambridge Associates, I would kind of describe the difference between my work in that with USAID, I was trying to be very catalytic for those new innovative ideas. The first fund by an investment team that was trying to do something that really hadn't been done much before, right? Very few people are investing in sustainable fisheries, or very few people are trying to invest in and make returns off of protecting sustainable rainforest or protecting endangered rainforests. And a lot of people are trying to put grant money towards it, but if you're talking about putting money in and getting a profit from it, there's not much of that. And now I sit in supporting those asset owners that are saying, you know what? That seems pretty risky. My level of fear is way up here, and my greed, I don't know if they're equal right now. And the issue is because this is the capital that I am advising on that goes to pay the bills, and they're expecting profits from this capital. Whereas before, in the fund one, in the early stages, many of the investors are doing it with something, and this is something I think that is helpful for the fellows to know about, something called program-related investments from a lot of foundations, which are investments that are capable of taking higher levels of risk because they're treated in the same bucket as their grant-making dollars. And so some of them, some foundations use this, some don't. But when you give a grant, you're expecting $0 in return. And so all $100 go out the door and none of it comes back. If they choose to make some program-related investments, the $100 goes back out the door in the form of an investment. If some of it comes back, that's great. Many times not back. I'd love for some of it to come back, maybe all dollars, maybe even a little profit. But when you transition from working with those investors that are saying, I'm willing to take more risk, to investors that are saying, we need to be achieving a certain annual return with our pots of money so that we can pay the bills, we need to be a little bit more diligent about which investments to move forward with. And how we choose those is, if it's the first idea in investing in sustainable fisheries, we might wait and see how that one goes and wait for fund 2 and say, okay, fund 1 worked out really well at a size of 100 million. They're trying to raise 250 million next time, and like the profits that they made, and we love the impact that they did. So let's put some of our capital in for fund 2. Another issue is how much is the risk being mitigated? We are looking at this whole risk mitigation, whether it be through guarantees or first loss capital or insurance. Many times it's called blended finance, in that you're blending some pure looking for return in addition to impact dollars with some capital or some other tool that is not at market rate. The credit guarantee was not a market rate instrument. And if there's enough of that blended finance, then we'll say, you know what, we love the impact. We think without the credit guarantee or without the first loss capital, they'd probably not hit the 15% return that we're trying to achieve here. But with it, that seems like a reasonable assumption. We can move our money into this. And that's something else that through Cambridge, I'm spending a lot of time on those blended finance deals, where it's like we're those investors that say we're not coming to the table yet, and then put something else in front of us that mitigates the risk or increases the return, and we say we could see some clients that would like this idea.
Right. Yeah, I know. So, I mean, it's interesting when you talk about blended finance and the role of government. I mean, obviously, government, most people think about, okay, they write the rules, they legislate, they write laws, and they say, you cannot destroy that piece of environment. This is a slightly different role for government in the sense of, hey, we're going to put our finger on the scale here and lower the risk for projects that achieve a certain conservation or development or other goals. So it's an innovative tool. And from the role of the private capital, it's saying, okay, it's lowering my risk. We're going to blend our capital with, government capital, and you also talked about foundations, philanthropic capital, which can take greater risks or be the first loss. And there's, a subtle difference between the credit guarantee and the first loss structure. The first loss, as the name implies, is basically saying, they'll put some money in. If there are losses, that money will go back to pay back the losses. The other investors don't suffer, so it's a bit of a buffer, a loss buffer for the investor. Whereas a credit guarantee is similar in a lot of ways, but it's a different kind of structure. And it's interesting that we're seeing more of this kind of blended finance, but now you're looking at it from another perspective and you're saying, is the blended finance enough? Is it really lowering my risk enough? Is it going to achieve the returns that the investor wants? Can you give us some examples of like the investments you make now that and how you might analyze the investments you were doing at USAID from your current perspective at Cambridge? What would you say if the Morova deal came your way today?
Yeah. So at USAID, we were impact first. If there was an impact theme that USAID, the US government, we were behind, we would try really hard to make that deal work, right? It didn't matter that they were the first ones. That was even better. They thought their strategy and their mission was to go out and make money investing in sustainable fisheries. We loved it. We loved it. We would think. Oh, there's a little bit of playback.
Yeah, your video's breaking up a little bit, but we can hear you.
Okay. So at Cambridge, it's not quite the case. While we love the impact, and some of our clients are very much impact driven, our impact team mission statement says flat out that we will not sacrifice returns in achieving impact. So in addition to it being sustainable fisheries, if that were the objective of one client, we would need to say, okay, well, they're actually investing in a lot of South America and Latin America and some Africa and Asia, which traditionally are considered higher risk countries than Western Europe and the US. Therefore, if you're getting certain returns in Western Europe and the US, you would expect a little bit higher returns in these developing countries. And so we would want to say, okay, love the sustainable fisheries, but are they making between, I don't know, high teens return with this because we can invest in the US and probably get 10 or 12%. So we'd love to see 15 or more. If not, it's like, oh, is this really the deal for us? And that's where, in some instances that I've been working on, blended finance has come into play. And we said, especially in emerging markets, where I've kind of taken on a lot of that for the impact team at Cambridge Associates, because everyone says, well, you have that emerging market risk, and many of the fellows are from emerging market countries. Unfortunately, the situation is it's just perceived higher risk for less stability than some of Western Europe and North America. And so finding ways to make those deals happen takes a little bit more work from my current seat than it did previously, where we almost embraced it. We said they're doing what we want them to do. You know, because USAID, we had been given a lot of grant money towards this, and all of a sudden we can work with an investor that's trying to do it from an investment side.
Sorry, can you give an example of an investment you've made from Cambridge? Or I don't know if you can talk about it, but if there's one you can talk about that you can say, this is kind of the kind of deals we're doing or looking for, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So there are a number of deals that we look at. I'm trying to think emerging markets specifically because I'm aware of our audience. We do a lot of deals focused on innovations and technologies, venture capital, which I didn't do a lot of or any of at USAID, trying to find those technologies that will be groundbreaking for the environment and for climate change in the future. But also in emerging markets, we're looking at we're looking at one that's going to invest with one of the biggest fund managers out there, the biggest maybe fund managers out there in the world, that has invested in a lot of renewable energy funds in developed countries, and they want to do it in the developing world, renewable wind, renewable solar. And their traditional investment base, including our clients, are saying, you know what, if you're giving us 12, 13%, 14% returns in the US and Canada, why should we be okay with just 18% returns if you're targeting primarily sub-Saharan Africa? And so a number of foundations have actually come into that deal and said, we're way smaller amount of the money you're trying to raise. We're less than 10% of the money that you're trying to raise, but we're also willing to take a smaller percentage of the returns to see all that big amount of capital come in. They're trying to raise $500 million in this, and the foundations are at like 50 million right now, not even. And so they're saying we'll be okay with a smaller return, but we want to see, because we know how important $500 million worth of renewable energy will be to a lot of these countries. So that would be an example of how we're trying to make all this work in renewable energy. There is, in terms of conservation, we're looking at a lot of regenerative agricultural type work and sustainable agriculture in emerging markets, and how, as agriculture is so important in so many emerging markets, how we can, instead of making these agricultural farms more sustainable and carbon sinks rather than carbon emitters over time, with some of the new technologies that are out there.
Great. Why don't we switch over to questions from the folks listening in. I want to start with Jenna Stoner. Jenna, do you want to, maybe Shelby can unmute you and you can ask your question.
Yeah, hi there, thanks. My question is around how the sustainability criteria for the investment standards get established. So I appreciate that you spoke a little bit about it being a back and forth with the lender, but is there an opportunity for field experts or sector experts to advise on what that kind of minimum bar should be that we're all looking for?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure what group you're coming from, Jenna, but Many times that is the case because the financial institutions, even if it's a new investment fund, like I mentioned, Althelia, a lot of these investment funds, these are just finance investment professionals that come from a history of being investors and might have some knowledge of the theme that they're going towards, whether it be sustainable agriculture or fisheries, but they're not many times environmental experts in fisheries. And so they will utilize a third party, oftentimes a nonprofit, to work with them on creating what should be their scope for sustainability in their investments. I know that the Environmental Defense Fund has worked with certain ones. I know that that Conservation International and TNC, the Nature Conservancy, have worked with certain ones, basically securing or ensuring that for the investors that they're going about this properly, because it is, we've talked a lot about returns and the investors looking for returns, but the investors, the impact is very important to the investors as well, in that if they weren't so concerned about the impact, they just go and put their money in more traditional investment opportunities and not worry about all this whole piece. And so when they work with a reputable technical team on whatever the theme might be, it gives the investment group, the investment fund, the lender, much more credibility. And how they go about selecting that, that's usually experts in the field that they develop relationships with as they're developing their strategies.
And I mean, I've also seen cases where experts in the field or some of those NGOs that you talk about have worked with and lobbied government to create these types of mechanisms in the first place. And when they do that, they actually help establish what are the criteria for getting these loans or loan guarantees or what have you. So, you know, you can get involved in a process that's already exists, or you can help create new approaches to achieving these kind of conservation outcomes. And the same goes for foundations. Lots of NGOs have worked with foundations to create similar types of mechanisms, either to provide, you know, loans for buying conservation properties or issues of water or what have you. So there's lots of different ways that experts can get involved with these providers of capital. And it's important to know that grants aren't the only way the governments and foundations can help achieve conservation. There are these types of blended capital structures that JP was talking about that are also interesting. So let's turn to, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Chaitanya Krishna, just to want to make sure that we answered your question, or if you have any follow-up questions on the stuff that JP was saying.
Hi, that was great, JP. Thank you so much. If you could talk about the ocean plastic, a bit about the work that you did with ocean plastics, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So if you're involved in projects that deal with ocean plastics, you should be aware of an investment group, a newer investment group called Circulate Capital. They are based out of Singapore, and their first investment fund is focused in Southeast Asia. They based themselves there because of studies that have demonstrated that of all the largest polluters of ocean plastics into the ocean, those highly concentrated island countries are, I think it was 7 of the top 10 right over in that general area. And what Circulate Capital has done is raised, I don't remember the number, it's somewhere between 120 and 180 million dollars to invest in businesses through both debt and equity. So some of the investments, they'll just own a piece of the company directly, and some they'll provide loans to. We're guaranteeing the loan side through USAID. And those companies are all along the cycle, the value chain of plastic creation and collection. So some of them are working, some of the investments will be working with municipalities on better collections of plastics, because the issue with ocean plastics is often an issue of sanitation and waste collection, and much of it flowing from rivers into oceans of small island countries where the rivers don't have to go too far to reach the ocean. And other projects are working with innovative ideas in plastic alternatives, kind of more the venture capital, early stage investment ideas. Some of them are working with community-based projects in trying to think about how they can mitigate the plastics and stem the plastic flow down the rivers and into the ocean. So there's a wide range, largely targeting, although I know the lead of Circulate Capital and is looking at targeting other countries with new funds in the future. But right now it's that Southeast Asia, also India and Sri Lanka area that they're looking to invest capital right now. And one unique thing about this this fund was that in raising the capital, in getting those asset owners to put that $100 and whatever million into the fund, instead of just targeting the typical investors, the foundations and high net worth individuals, he went after corporations. And because corporations have huge issue with plastics and plastics in the oceans. So he got commitments from Coca-Cola and Pepsi and from Dow Chemical, and there's Procter and Gamble and Unilever and others that know that they need to help solve the problem. And so it's an interesting group of investors in his fund.
Yeah, and I think, you know, actually the fund started with discussions with those consumer products and packaged goods companies that are producing a lot of the plastics that is ending up in the ocean. So, you know, it was a sort of circular discussion with them as well that led to the creation of the fund. And, you know, I've reached out. I know Rob Kaplan, who's one of the founder and running that, and I've reached out for him to do one of these.
That's great.
We may have him on talking about that in the future. But yeah, very interesting structure he's built, and hopefully we'll learn a little bit more. I see there's a question from our beloved Nigel Asquith. Nigel.
Hi JP, how's it going?
Hey Nigel.
Now, as I direct the Kinship program, we get a lot of fellows coming in the projects. And you mentioned earlier that fellows often come with a program, they come to the program with a project that really can't get a rate of return. They're all kind of grant projects with a negative 100% return on that investment. And perhaps in my experience, that's the most of conservation projects. Most conservationists listening today are going to have projects that aren't going to make a return, or we can come to the table with brand new projects, and I think that's a lot of where your thinking comes from is new people. But those of us who have just got our old traditional conservation projects, is there any way? Have you thought about how a kind of standard old project can transition into making it get a financial return? Should we be looking for ecosystem services that they can sell, as it were? Have you thought at all about that? Thanks.
So there's one point that I want to bring up, and that's tangential to your question, and then I'll answer your question as well. And that what you do with your bee boxes down in South America, Nigel, and what some others do, I think there is a way to bring investors into some of these projects, even if they're not receiving a financial rate of return. If right now what you're utilizing is grants to pay a lot of your way for the cost of your project, and that is through either whether they be called social or developmental impact bonds. And I bring this up because USAID, as I was leaving, and other government agencies are starting to look a little bit more at how they can play a role in impact bonds. The traditional concept is that you receive a grant from an organization, an aid or philanthropic organization, and use that money to do your project. For Nigel, it's the protection of the water streams by providing bee boxes, but whatever your project is, through the grant, and then that project is successful by utilizing that money, and the water remains clean for the downstream utilizers. But if you have more of a pay for success or development impact bond model, what you could do is bring investors in and the grant makers, and it might not always make sense, because if you say I'm getting grants anyway, why complicate things more? But an investor could say, well, instead of the grant maker giving you the $100 to do your project, we'll give you $100, but we're expecting $105 at the end of the project. And you're going to take that $100 and do what you do so well and protect the water streams for the downstream users. And then the grant maker will say, well, we're only going to pay out if it's successful. If that water clarity is tested at the grade that we deem successful through your negotiations ahead of time, we'll pay out, but we'll pay out $105 rather than $100, and we'll pay the investors. But the investors are going to take that risk that maybe for whatever reason, Nigel's project did not work as well, and therefore they might not get paid or not paid back as much. There's going to be a sliding scale. It's not going to be binary. You get everything or you don't get anything. But these types of pay for success or impact bond, there's a lot of ways to structure it, are becoming, government's a slow process, and all of these things, if any of you that have tried to work with government, you know what I'm saying, but they're becoming more popular with government agencies because they see the inclusion of the private sector investors in as parties to these agreements. And I know Waylon Matson from my Kinship Fellow cohort is working on one at the border of Tijuana and San Diego right now, based on flow of trash into the oceans as well. So that is one way to bring investors involved. Now, to actually generate revenues, it's a challenge when I know how long Nigel's worked in those communities and you just don't see revenue opportunities. Even for something like what Waylon is doing, I don't want to speak about Waylon's project specifically too much, but I know someone else gets paid to clean up the trash that's flowing into the oceans right now. And what Waylon identifies is a cheaper and more efficient way to do it by stopping it at the source rather than collecting it at the riverbed or at the basin where it flows into the ocean in San Diego. And so if you find those more efficient ways of doing things, there's a way to structure financial transactions. Sometimes it just might be more complicated than it's worth, totally. And if you're getting good grants from agencies that you have great relationships with, it might be best to just say, my work is what it is in terms of I don't need to overcomplicate things. But if it's difficult and you're always looking for the next place that's going to give you a grant, and is it going to come this year? Or are we going to, be struggling to get by this year? Bringing in more private sector entities into the mix might be ways of keeping your grant providers interested in saying, okay, they're trying to be more commercial with their projects, and we don't just foresee ourselves 20 years down the road doing the same thing, writing the same check at the beginning of the year every year. Just one idea. Ricardo, you might have some thoughts.
We did have the first session with Eric Letzinger, who works a lot on sort of these pay for performance structures. And I think what's important to realize is that there has to be an ultimate payer at the end of the day. Private sector is basically stepping in and saying, I'll do it faster, I'll provide you the money now, I'll take some of that risk that the project will actually work or will not work. But generally speaking, they'll take that risk if there's a way for them to get paid to take that risk in some way, shape, or form. So sometimes you have to think about what is the payment you're making for these private investors to come in and take that risk. So even in the case of the water bond and the green infrastructure type bond that Eric works on, you talk to another agency, he worked with DC. DC was willing to pay somebody to take the risk that green infrastructure would perform. Other cities may say, why am I going to pay to have someone take that risk? I'll take that risk and not pay anybody. I can do that. I can get cheaper capital. So there's a lot of nuance in that, but I think it's an interesting way if you have somebody who is willing to pay to have an outcome, to charge for that outcome, and to have somebody step in to take some of those risks. I think the question that Nigel also points to is, do we have the kind of financial expertise in thinking about where can you possibly have revenue from the projects you're doing? And we worked advising also the U.S. government, NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, they provide billions of dollars through the U.S. Farm Bill to farmers in the U.S. for conservation practices. We were trying to answer the question, could you bring in private investment to help with some of that? And the answer sort of came in the form of, it is important for NRCS to sort of separate the money they're giving in these billions of dollars into where are the projects that will probably never really have a return on investment, but where are the projects that will potentially have a return on investment. So in other words, if you lower fertilizer usage, that can provide a return on investment. And those start looking at ways that private capital can play a role. And I think this applies to developing countries as well, and projects in developing countries. Separate out your project. What are the things you do where there could be a return on investment, and where are the things you do that probably can't have a return on investment? The ones that do, then you have options to work with private sector, and whether that's carbon credits, water quality trading, ecosystem markets for ecosystem services, which can also be complicated or hard to set up, or require government intervention, or require certification. So they're not simple, but they may provide you some sort of return, or even the entrepreneurship or the venture of doing bee boxes, as you were saying. Maybe the honey is a potential return on investment. Maybe their products, whether it's wood or food or fuel or fiber or something that can be sold and provide a return on investment. So start parsing out your projects in that way. Potential return, not potential return, I think is an important way to be thinking about this.
One thing I don't discount is that in a lot of the countries and what a lot of the fellows and listeners are from, they don't have regulated markets to take advantage of that we do, you and I, Ricardo, in the US, where whether it be mitigation banking or easements or anything like that. And so I understand how doing conservation is not as easy to generate the revenue as it could be other places.
Yeah, and it goes both ways. There are certain innovations that happen in developing countries of different types of markets, markets and private reserves that had begun to emerge in Brazil, though I think they're not working quite as well as they did. But things that hadn't even been tried here that are being tried elsewhere. So there's innovation everywhere, and thinking about that, where is that potential return, I think is an important lesson that we take from this work on conservation finance. I know we have at least 2 more questions. So Richard and Diga, you want to ask your questions?
Thanks, Ricardo. Thanks, JP. Loving your presentation. My first question is, what has been your success rate for all the projects that you financed, both at USAID and Cambridge? And my second one, which probably I think Ricardo has answered partly, but the question is, because most of the conservation projects do not have the expertise when it comes to finance. So, I mean, here I have my project, but I don't know how to do my evaluations. I don't know how to do my cash flow projections. So do you help with this to determine determine the returns on investment?
So in terms of success rate, specifically with the credit guarantee, it was what we considered successful in the credit guarantee would be that we supported lending that there were some defaults, so that we knew they were kind of on the edge of the most impactful deals they could do, but not a ton of defaults, so that it was a demonstration effect, and that they'd say, you know what, overall, it was meaningful for us to put our money towards this conservation project because we made a return, we made a decent return, and we're going to do it again. And next time we might not even need a credit guarantee or any other kind of risk mitigation, or maybe we do next time. But the third time, we're going to just go off and do it because it makes financial sense. And so the loss rate, I believe it was 2.5% over the 20 years and $6 billion that went out the door. So that means a 97.5% success rate in terms of the loans that were made. And that was the success of our financial partners, meaning that we did not pay out, which also was success for the US government as well. In terms of, and I get it because I recognized it with the fellows in my cohort, the lack of financial, just the lack of really expertise in finance and cash flow modeling. And I don't typically have time to be providing the kind of consulting service. And I would say, depending on where your project is, you don't want to be asking or paying for someone to be doing that for you. You really want to be breaking it down to the simplest forms, as Ricardo mentioned a couple of times, in terms of, do I have revenue generating opportunities? What are they? How much could I potentially make? How are they compared to my costs? And so where am I even in that mix? Am I still going to be at a loss making at the end of the year because it costs me $100 to run my whole project, and the most I'm going to pull from it is $15? Or is it more like, if we have a good year, we might make $150 out of our $100 project? But I'm assuming there are support opportunities. I don't know where they are off the top of my head. I would recommend checking out some websites like the Conservation Finance Network, for one, where I know a lot of Yale MBAs are always participating and might be able to support. But do you know of any, Ricardo, off the top of your head, where such projects could get kind of the support they would need?
Not specifically in the sort of like analysis of costs and revenue opportunities, but sometimes investment groups like Althelia or like Encourage work with specific projects on that. The Conservation Finance Network, which you mentioned, I think that's more sort of US based, but they have a lot of expertise, and they can point you in some interesting directions of people who have done this kind of projects. There are some training courses out there, and what is it, Conservation Strategy group out of California that does trainings as well, and might be able to provide services. I think a lot of NGOs now are starting to create that financial expertise internally. So TNC, the Nature Conservancy, has an internal group called NatureVest, which looks for these kinds of opportunities and provides that support. I think, granted, for the time being, a lot of that is being provided to TNC internally, so other parts of TNC, but Conservation International has similar groups, WWF has similar groups, so you might approach them and see if there's a conservation finance expertise in any of those groups that you work with locally that might be able to help. I think it's interesting because when we started Echo Asset Management, which was the investment firm I started, way over 10 years ago now, we had trouble finding people that had that dual expertise, sort of like in conservation and in finance. So what we ended up doing was hiring people with a lot of financial expertise and then hiring people with a lot of environmental expertise and sitting them in a room together to work on deals together. I think that's changing now. I think a lot of programs, you mentioned Yale, but Stanford, Duke, Santa Barbara, a lot of the universities, at least in the US, are now creating joint degree programs that people come out of those programs with that dual expertise on the financial, economic, and environmental. And so maybe some of these universities could actually be interesting places to tap and look into. Maybe working with some graduate students or even undergraduate students who can bring some of that expertise, or at least help you begin the analysis. I know it's hard. If it were easy, everybody would be doing it, but there are people out there that are willing to help, from the NGOs and government agencies and the universities, and even some of the investment funds like ours. We help a lot of projects on the ground think through these things as well. And there's a lot of training courses that are emerging, including, Kinship has evolved to do some of this over the years. So it's a different world than when we started, but it's still definitely difficult. And if I think of any others, Richard, reach out to me and I can try and put you in touch. Or if you have a specific project that you would like somebody to help you with, reach out as well, and I can see who I can put you in touch with that might be able to help you with it. Okay, so we have, looks like one last question, oh, two more questions. One from Stefan Tangen. Stefan, you there?
Yep, I am here. Thank you all for such great information. Yeah, the question I had is specific to if there are risk mitigating tools, like you're talking about the tool at USAID, available domestically, specifically for climate adaptation projects.
So,
So you broke up there a little, just reading from your question, it says, are there currently risk mitigating tools like at USAID operating domestically for climate adaptation projects?
Yeah. I believe that was the whole question. And so there are other guarantee products specific to within other agencies. The challenge is, are there any specific to conservation? For example, the credit guarantee that we have, there's a very similar program at the Department of Energy supporting renewables, and where they make both direct loans to riskier projects and guarantees on riskier projects. And there is at the Department of Ag as well. What I haven't, and I've spoken with some people at Interior when I was at USAID, trying to see how they were supporting conservation related topics. I haven't uncovered any that are as widely used and as successful maybe and well known as the products that I worked on and the one at DOE and some others. I know that as I mentioned, the fellow from my cohort, Waylon, has tried to work with a couple of US-based institutions on tools that they have, and I don't think anything's completely fit for him. And there's some other stories where I've understood that things haven't worked out quite as efficiently or worked out quite as well as we'd like in terms of creating such a product. So I will let you know if I hear of any, if you want to just send me an email. But I can't think of any off the top of my head. Do you know of any, Ricardo?
No, I think you hit on the big one, which is the DOE projects that did provide credit guarantees, loans, investments, venture capital for, renewable energy technologies. I think there are lots and lots of subsidies for renewable energy in the U.S., whether at the federal level or at the state level also. So, some of them take the form of credit guarantees. We did talk to USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and NRCS, which is underneath USDA, about credit guarantees. They do provide more broad-based sort of credit guarantees for farmers, not specifically tied to conservation or climate change, but they have been thinking about what would that look like and how could you create something like that coming out of USDA. And one thing to remember is that, they are probably the biggest impact investor out there in some ways, because they literally provide, tens of billions of dollars to farming in the US through the Farm Bill. So lots of interesting potential there. They have conservation innovation grants, which are sort of grants to try things that are new. I think one or two of them looked at, can you provide credit guarantees on carbon projects? So you might start looking there. So there's lots of things at the state level for energy, renewable energy. I think a lot less for sort of land-based climate change activities. A lot on venture capital for energy and renewable energy, not so much on other types of approaches to climate change that are not kind of renewable energy related, I'd say. But there's a huge opportunity there, I think. I think some of the banks had also talked about doing and creating structures like that. I know Goldman Sachs had talked about it. I know Blackstone has made a commitment to do much more climate investment. So there may be things coming down the pike. I know JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Credit Suisse, all of them had talked about structures like that. I can't off the top of my head think of any that actually created a credit guarantee that looks like the USAID one for the US. But if something does come to mind, I'll definitely reach out.
Yeah, it'd be great if that ag one, I'm familiar with the ag one, but I knew it to just support the traditional farming practice. So if it starts to transition to incorporate more conservation activity as well, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, you know, there is a whole conservation title of the Farm Bill. So again, a small part of the broader Farm Bill, but still billions of dollars that go out. And so they've been thinking about how do you innovate with that, and a lot of good people working on this question at NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which used to be the Soil Conservation Service of the U.S. So happy to put anybody that's interested in touch with people there, doing some stuff.
I think this is a good reminder that one thing is, and if this is frustrating people, it's not super easy to work with government agencies and large bureaucracies, right? And that's why I'd say if you're in another country, or start local, right? If there's an aid agency that does a lot of work in that country, go to them first and explain your project and see where it fits in with their scope of their work. Or if you're in the US and you're working on a localized project, start with the local the local government organizations first, and see what they have to provide. You know, just calling up or trying to figure out within Washington where things are, I think it's purposely complicated so that others can't figure it out. And this is from someone that was there for a while, and yeah, I know you worked with various agencies as well, Ricardo, so it's not easy.
Yeah, I mean, we had encouraged, we just raised about 70 million for a fund that provides capital to small and medium enterprises in India that are doing renewable energy. And some of them, I wouldn't say they're credit guarantees, but they do look at kind of lowering risk exposure to increase the potential for some of these small and medium enterprises to install renewable energy and solar. And you know, some of that stuff is modeled on stuff that was done in the US on renewable energy. So again, probably lots of stuff on renewable energy. If what your interest is the broader climate change and climate adaptation and climate mitigation, I think beyond energy, it starts to get a lot less populated with structures. So, but I think there's some innovation going to be happening. I see that Romas Garballiascas, I'm sorry if I mangled your name, has an answer for Richard on providing support. Romas, you want to tell us about it?
Hey, Romas.
Hi guys. Hi Ricardo. Hi JP. Good presentation. Thank you. Yeah, it was just on I guess the point was whether or not there's some free financial analyst resources. A few years ago, UCLA Anderson School, I think they have a program. We worked with the program of theirs once or twice. I think it was a relatively small fee, but they'll put a team of like 4 MBA students to help you out with your project. And then the other one is something we participated in twice, and that's the Climate Finance Lab. Now that's a highly competitive accelerator program. It has to be tied to climate change mitigation and adaptation, innovation, scalability, and so on. And that's one every year they have a window to actually be accepted into the accelerator. But one of the great benefits is that for 7 months you get free analysts from the Climate Policy Initiative to help you develop your idea. So just 2 other ideas to throw out there.
Right. Yeah, and that actually reminds me that TNC runs a similar competition on kind of conservation finance projects every year. Or at least they did a couple of years back, and part of what you win is help developing your project. So TNC has a similar structure now that I think about it as well. And anybody can apply, not just TNC projects, obviously. So that brings us to the time, 11:30. I want to thank JP for providing your expertise and all the learnings you've had over the years and the many cool projects you've done both at USAID and now at Cambridge. Hope to see much more of you in your projects, and so much appreciate all the wisdom and insight provided, JP. And thanks everyone for listening. And if you have any follow-up questions, as usual, let us know either directly or through Shelby. All feedback is welcome. If there are particular innovations you would like to hear more about, please do let us know. And again, appreciate all your time and energy, JP, and wish you all the best in the new endeavors and surviving the craziness that is this world with a pandemic and everything going on. So appreciate it, JP.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Ricardo, for having me, and thank Kinship, as always. What a great organization. So thanks.
Thanks, JP. Thanks, Ricardo, so much. And everyone, a short survey will pop up as you leave. So if you can fill that out, you can give us feedback there, which would be greatly appreciated. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Shelby, and thanks, Ceci, and thanks everybody who put a lot of work into making this happen. Appreciate it too. Take care, everyone.